Hi, welcome to the Electric Revolution Skills Hub podcast. My name is Dean, and in this episode, we'll be speaking to an amazing explorer, Alex Hibbert. He talks about his adventures in minus 44 degree conditions, how climate change is affecting the regions, and his up-and-coming challenge. It's fun, it's scary, and you won't want to miss it. Hi, Alex. How are you?
Hello, I'm very good, thanks. It's a busy day, but it's nice to be here to talk to you.
What are you up to today?
Well, I've actually just finished organising all of our freight, which is about to head up to northern Alaska. It's a great deal easier, believe me, than having sort of 4 or 5 bags turning up to the airport. And so everything is obviously organised, listed, and then shrink wrapped, ready to head up to the far north. And then later on today, I'll be heading to the Midlands to give a speech. So it's going to be a fairly full-on day for me. But it's nice in the final days before heading on an expedition to have different things to focus your mind on.
I gave you a short introduction at the start. Obviously, do you want to sort of expand on that for people that don't know of you? Just to let guys know, the YouTube channel that Alex has got is absolutely amazing and quite frightening in places.
Absolutely, the YouTube channel, actually, before I do the quick intro, was a slight accident after lockdown, because I had lots and lots of footage of obviously the expeditions that I do, but also this expedition lifeboat that I've been working on a project that COVID then put pay to. And I thought it would be amusing to put some sort of basic edits up on YouTube, and then all of a sudden it took off. So that's now become another string to all the things I have to do work-wise. But yes, my background, so I studied biology back when I was an undergraduate, and I was always interested in doing things in the outside, in the outdoors, but also to have a cerebral element to everything that I do. And I had this idea that I wanted to go to the Arctic, and I thought maybe it would just be once, maybe that would be it, and I would get it out of my system. But once I completed my first big expedition called the Long Haul, which was organised mostly whilst I was at university, and then I went and completed with a friend of mine, I then realised that I simply had to do this for a living. I had to upscale absolutely everything from the expeditions all the way through to equipment and clothing and communications, everything that I wanted to try and sort of push forward and innovate. So I created a career around that. And of course, most people will probably guess that if you're creating a career out of expeditions, out of journeys, just trying to get from one place to another while staying alive and hopefully staying friends with your teammates, then you then need things that branch off from that. And I found the best ways of communicating with people is through speaking and writing. But also I'm moving more towards broadcast. And also I like to do a lot of things behind the scenes too, helping, as I just mentioned, developing equipment and clothing and gadgetry, I suppose you could say, in order to try and push things a little bit further forward, because there's a bit of a history of quote unquote explorers looking back a bit, doing sort of reenactment expeditions and pretending to be from a past time. But of course, we're not. But at the same time, I didn't want to be a modern adventurer who just did everything the easy way. And so I've specialized in what's known as unsupported polar travel, which is basically doing the physical work yourself and being self-sufficient without resupplies along the way. And I've also become a bit of a winter specialist. And I suppose you would imagine that, of course, you would be traveling in winter. It's the Arctic. You need snow. And that's right. But normally people travel in the sensible time of year, which is sort of spring, summer. And certainly the Antarctic season is almost always a summer season. I decided that winter would be sort of that extra notch of challenge. Because, of course, when you go to the higher latitudes, you don't get a great deal of sunlight. And in fact, sometimes for months on end, you get no sunlight whatsoever. So I've become a sort of a winter specialist and unsupported specialist. And I've tried to have a career that spans a number of different areas to keep me interested, really.
What's the difference between the summer and winter in those climes?
It depends where you are. So if you're on land during the summertime, it's highly likely that there won't be any snow cover. And so it can be rocky and dusty, and there can be some sort of low shrubs and vegetation. And so traveling across that is extremely difficult. You could hike, I suppose. But also if you have lakes and sort of marshy areas, there are flies become an enormous problem. So for me, I find that summer travel doesn't have a great deal to recommend it. Those who are into kayaking, I'm sure, will feel differently, because there are some amazing Arctic rivers which people can either pack raft or kayak or so on. When you're talking about sea ice, in the summertime, there will still be some sea ice in many areas, but of course it's fraction and it moves around a great deal. And you can have melt pools on top of it. You can get foggy conditions. So the summer is really a very different beast to the spring or the winter time. Up high on ice caps, you might not be able to visually tell the difference between the winter and the summer, but the way that the surface behaves and the way that the weather performs, that will be the thing that will make the difference. And you might think, well, if you're going to cross an ice cap, why not do it in summer because you have lots of sunlight? Surely that sounds much better. But of course, if you end up with temperatures which, say, on the Greenland ice sheet and some of the lower elevations are around zero, around sort of the thaw temperature, you can get such slushy snow conditions that it's a nightmare to travel. So it's not always obvious that traveling in a more benign time of year is going to be better for you. And then, of course, as the temperatures drop and the light dims for the winter, and I'm talking about both the Arctic and the Antarctic, of course, at the different times of year, the ice and the snow will then thicken, consolidate, and, in my opinion, give you a much better traveling surface. But then, of course, you might have to deal with worse weather and, of course, much lower temperatures.
How do you think the temperatures have changed? Greenland is somewhere where you've been back a few times, isn't it? If I'm correct.
Yeah, I've been to Greenland over a dozen times, and the thing about expeditions in my sort of let's say I'm going to be traveling on the ice for a few decades. The difference that I'm going to see on expeditions from what might be a cumulative 2, 3, 4 degree overall change in air temperature, I'm probably not going to notice. What I notice most as a traveler is, in fact, the different weather conditions, that the wider global impacts of what's happening and the change that's happening, what those impacts lead to. And that can mean storms. It can mean more storms earlier in the season. It can also mean that the sea ice behaves very differently. So although I'm not going to be noticing a degree or two, what I do notice is the unpredictability. Now, the Arctic has always been an unpredictable place to travel. You know that a storm can appear in a split second, but it's the ferocity and it's the unusual times of year that these now seem to be rolling through that can take you unawares and you need to be aware of. I think that the changes in Greenland are going to be more noticeable for the people who live there year round, because, of course, I can pick my times to travel. And in fact, even if I was to say, right, the late spring, for instance, is now no longer good for travel because the thaw comes a little bit earlier than it did 10 years ago, I'm just going to shift everything forward a bit. So I will simply set off 2 weeks earlier or 3 weeks earlier. So I can actually adjust for that. The problem comes for those who live there permanently, and they can't be as picky as I can about travel times.
So what's that going to be like you just said that change over the last 10 years. What's that going to be like over the next 50 years?
Well, I don't think anyone really knows. I mean, you can look at the trends, you can look at the graphs, and we can, of course, extrapolate where that's going to go next. Now, of course, things can slow, things can accelerate. Most people, I suppose, will assume that if this graph is going off in a certain trajectory, that's likely to continue unless something dramatic changes in the planet's behavior and in our behavior, I suppose, as well.
Our behavior, yeah.
In 50 years' time, I suspect in 50 years' time it might be towards the end of my career, and I expect that the possibilities for expeditions will be completely and utterly unrecognizable compared to what we can manage now. And even in the last 10 years, I've only been going just over a decade. What I have noticed is that certain logistical options, so places where we used to be able to be dropped off for expeditions 10 years ago, and even just sort of when I was looking at getting into expeditions and was still seeing it as more of a theory in my future, and I was looking at other people's expeditions, I was looking at possibilities for being dropped off, for instance, off the Russian coast for North Pole expeditions. Now, that has been completely impossible for years now, and even in the final days, in the final few years when the Russians were offering logistics, this is a private Russian company that used to offer helicopter drop-offs for North Pole expedition teams. The last communication I had off the boss was there is enough ice off the Cape, off the bit of land where we would set off from, maybe for a cocktail. There is not enough ice for you to ski on. Whereas just a few years later, they were setting off 2 or 3 teams a year onto good quality sea ice, and they were able to travel north from there. So yes, the change is substantial even within the period of time that I've been working. And in Greenland, I tend to come back to Greenland a lot because it's where I've traveled most, even though I don't want to be typecast as just a Greenland guy.
Yeah.
But the routes that I was doing in 2007, 2008, which isn't that long ago, that was right back in my early 20s when I was getting started, those routes are now impossible. Because first of all, the government now won't give you a permit to travel early because they got worried about people basically getting too cold, which I didn't really fully understand. I believe that you should travel in the colder part of the season because then the snow and the ice tend to be in better condition. And frankly, you should be able to deal with cold temperatures if you're there. And that pushed people later into the season. And then the melt is sort of coming at you from the other end, at the other end of the season. And now the melt season is now constraining traveling so much that you simply couldn't do the routes that I was managing back then, including a nearly 4-month expedition, which obviously needs to have a very, very long window of travel time in order to fit that in. That was a 113-day expedition.
Yeah, in the intro, I talked about the IPCC that was able to prove in 2021 that there's a direct link between human activities and climate change, and just a gradual increase of warming, I suppose, around the planet. But it's causing problems with the infrastructure of the planet in terms of storms, seasons being more unpredictable than ever before, and even in Europe, we've seen that. And what people don't realize is that it really, I don't think it can be reversed. I don't know if you think that's the case. We can slow the issue, we can slow the warming, or we can neutralize it. There's got to be a lot of work for the world, really, whether it's consumers or whether it's certainly businesses, in things like electrification, moving more to a mass, really, of clean and renewable energies as well. Do you sort of believe that's going to help the slide at all? Well,
my area of interest is of course, the Arctic. And the Arctic is being disproportionately hit by changes in weather and changes in temperature over time. It appears that the temperature increases are higher there than the global average. And that can become a bit of a self-perpetuating system because the more, let's talk about sea ice on top of the oceans, the more sea ice that melts, the more water, of course, you have in between the chunks of ice. And that water is dark. The ice is light in color. And that it has a distinct effect on how the sunlight, which is then beating down on it, is absorbed. So in the past, the ice would, of course, reflect lots of light and therefore heat, and would actually reflect that back up into the atmosphere again and hopefully away to somewhere else. Now that you have a great deal more ocean exposed to the sunlight, that is heating up faster and faster because that dark water, that dark surface, is absorbing more light energy. So the Arctic does seem to be disproportionately affected. Now, in terms of what's causing what and whether things can be reversed or not, there are obviously 1,000 question marks, and I'm slightly reticent to join the ranks of certain activists who have decided that they know the answer to that, and everything is either going to be an absolute disaster, or on the flip side, it's all absolute nonsense. There's a little bit too much certainty from some camps. But I think that there's little controversy to say that there are probably two things at play here. First of all, the planet is not a static environment. The planet over millions and millions of years has been doing strange things. It's been going up and down in temperature. There are obviously our entire world changes shape through across tens of millions of years. All sorts of things that happen outside of our control. But it's fairly clear that we have been, let's say, soiling our nest. We have not been behaving well. Now, a lot of that happened long before we realized that it was a bad idea. So perhaps people who are trying to improve human existence back during the Industrial Revolution can be forgiven. I don't believe that they were evil, selfish people. What they were trying to do was develop humanity. Now, we're in a situation where it's quite clear now that what we have done is contributed to, accelerated, and maybe diverted the state of the world that would have been the case if we were not here. And so we need to make some changes. Can we reverse what's been done? Who knows? Do we want to reverse what's been done? Possibly. Do we want to slow what's going on so we can actually get a real handle on how big the problem is? I think yes. I think that allowing something to almost run away like an out of control locomotive is by definition going to be a bad idea. But there are so many other reasons why it's a good idea to stop burning things and cutting things down and reducing habitat for wildlife. There are so many reasons completely aside from our global temperature as to why that's a really bad idea. So I think most people can get on board with the idea that it's a good plan for us to look at our actions, look at our behavior, and decide a better way forward.
So I've watched pretty much all your videos on your channel, and if anybody watching this, please, I'll drop the link down below of Alex's channel. It's incredible. I know I've watched one recently with you in doing a test expedition in Canada, where you're using single skin tents in -40. I mean, it said -45, but it actually, I believe it reached the bottom of the thermometer where it didn't go anymore. How many layers do you wear in that sort of thing, and how on earth do you deal with the cold? I mean, I've put my blue lights on in the background to try and represent cold, but I've got the heating on, so that doesn't really count. How many layers? How do you even survive that long?
Yes, so do I. I certainly have the heating on here. People often assume that because of what I do for a living that I absolutely adore being cold. Now, actually, the skill of being an Arctic traveler, a cold weather traveler, is that you become rather good at becoming as comfortable as you possibly can. And that was exactly what we were trying to do in that tent at I think it was -44. I couldn't quite claim 45 on that particular night. Although last winter when I was up in Alaska, my teammate and I did get -47. So that's now my personal record for travel. At each sort of threshold of temperature, so let's say -20, -30, -40, -50, people think, oh, that just sounds incredibly cold. And it's difficult to understand how they affect the way that you have to behave and how things perform. At -20, if you're well dressed and you're exercising, it really is quite comfortable. Assuming that there's not a howling wind. And I've got footage of me skiing along at -20, -25 with an open with an open jacket, chatting to my camera and having a nice day. At -30, you need to really switch on and pay attention to your extremities and also look after your equipment that little bit more, because certainly plastics start to become slightly more fragile in low temperatures. Once you hit -40, your priority more or less shifts from mileage, because normally what you're trying to do is cover as many miles as you possibly can during the day, assuming you're not doing a science survey, assuming you're doing an exploratory journey. And it starts to shift more through to self-care and care, of course, for your teammates. It's about not making any mistakes. And when you get towards about -45, I mean, even camping, which is supposed to be the comfortable, pleasant time of the day, you have to just really pay attention to everything. In a single skin tent, it's not going to make a massive amount of difference because you don't have the sun shining down and giving you a nice sort of greenhouse effect. And really, you're not going to expect an incredibly thin layer of nylon, whether it's 1 or 2 layers thick, to really hold a great deal of heat in. And besides, we don't heat the tent. You're supposed to be very strict with the stove so that it's only doing something specific, like drying out something that's accidentally got damp or melting snow to make hot water. And if you saw a couple of clips in that video on YouTube where the burners were just running, that was a bit naughty. We shouldn't have been doing that. You're supposed to shut those off straight after the stoves are actually doing something. So the temperature inside the tent is not a great deal different to what it is outside. And you've just got to wear the right gear. Now, when you're actually traveling, you don't wear that much gear at all. And people are often surprised as to how little I do have on. If you are holding a big, heavy sledge behind you, a sledge that can weigh 150 up to 200 kilos, that's a lot of work going on. And so as long as those calories are going in, you'll keep yourself warm wearing a merino wool base layer and then essentially a maybe a soft shell windproof. You don't want any waterproof clothing because you're not going to get rained on. What you want is breathable clothing to let any moisture from within to get out, because you don't want to get damp. Damp is the absolute killer. So when you're exercising, you don't want to wear that much, even at minus 45. It's when you stop, then you're putting the tent up, camping, maybe doing some science work, communicating using the satellite phone. That's when you do layer up. And so I then have insulated trousers and an insulated jacket to keep me warm when I'm there. Now, the traditional clothing for keeping warm has more or less since the advent of sort of baffled clothing has been goose down, and there are issues around whether that's an ethical idea or not. And of course, there have been big strides in making sure that goose down clothing or duck down clothing comes from good sources. But it's only really useful in the spring or the summer. And I often laugh when people are walking around when it's raining outside in down jackets, because they just turn into a damp papier-mâché. It only works when they're dry. And if you get any dampness into it whatsoever, you'll end up with blocks of ice forming inside the goose down. So actually these days, because I do travel in the dark a lot, I tend to use goose down equivalent, like a synthetic insulation, and that works a lot better when you can't leave it out in the sun to dry out.
So you've got to keep your extremities warm. I saw a clip of you with the two burners on and your feet both sides of the burners. Is it important when it gets to a certain level?
That was a luxury,
yeah. That's probably naughty there. But if you get to a certain level of cold where it goes past, what point does it become cold into frostbite?
Well, frostbite's a complicated thing, because I think most people just assume frostbite means when your fingers go black and fall off. And that's obviously the most extreme form of frostbite. So you can get cold damage to your body, whether it's to your nose, cheeks. They're quite susceptible. Earlobes, if you actually accidentally let an earlobe just sit below the level of your beanie hat or whatever head protection you're wearing, that can quite easily get bitten. And then obviously toes and fingers. And you can get a bit of a shot across the bows sometimes and get a bit of a warning if you do make a mistake. And I've had that a few times, whereby I've just pushed it a little bit too far. I've allowed a finger or a toe get a little bit colder than I should have before doing something active to sort that problem out. And then you'll generally lose sensation. They'll turn white, but that's completely recoverable. That just means that the blood flow is having trouble getting into that extremity, and you've then got to actively rewarm it. And down below minus 40, you should be almost more than you should be thinking about navigating. You should be thinking about, how's my big toe? Yep, that big toe's good. How's that big toe? Constantly wiggling them around to reconfirm to yourself that they're still alive. And the same thing for your fingers and for your thumbs. And so if you let that go too far, if you're just a little bit blasé and you think, oh, it'll be fine. Okay. All I need to do is ski a little bit faster. That'll come back to life again. Then you can get a problem if you don't actively rewarm an extremity that is getting cold. And then beyond the blood flow pulling back from that extremity, which is what the body does to try and look after itself. It's a bit of a counterintuitive behavior that it undertakes. If that tissue actually freezes, if the skin and then the flesh beneath it actually freezes, those cells will of course die, and then that's going to be the first stage of frostbite. And even that, to a certain extent, that can just simply turn into a minor wound, and the body can actually recover. The nerves can recover, and that's a very painful process as the nerves essentially wake up again days or weeks later, and you get this horrible stinging sensation. But if you again ignore that happening, you can get large chunks of tissue freezing, literally freezing solid. All the water within the cells completely freeze, and at that point you will then eventually have loss of the end of a finger or even worse. And that's when things go black and fall off. And of course, because that flesh then starts to essentially rot, you can then get toxins ending up in your blood, and that can cause blood poisoning. And that's why something what you could say is only cosmetic, perhaps the loss of a finger, that can actually kill you because of what is then released into your bloodstream.
Wow, that's amazing. I bet some amateurs go out, don't they, and they don't really know all of this. They've not really experienced, and I think they probably struggle, don't they?
I think so. Yes, there are two sides to this. I don't believe that because what I do for a living gives me the sole right to go and travel in remote parts of the world. I've worked very hard over the years to get good at what I do, and I've specialized in one particular sort of travel. I didn't want to be like a generalist adventurer who's a bit rubbish at everything. I'd like to be as good as I can possibly get at my one sort of specialization. But people who don't have much experience, yes, they are at greater risk of wearing the wrong clothes, behaving in the wrong way. A very common mistake amongst amateurs or beginners is to simply wear too much clothing because they think, well, at the beginning of the day, it's really cold. I'll put all this on. They start moving, and then all of a sudden, they're a sweaty heap. All that sweat then turns to ice, and then all of a sudden, they're in serious trouble.
Couple of fun bits. Pringles. Are you sponsored by Pringles, Alex? Because in all of your...
I am not sponsored by Pringles
with you.
But I'm always a firm believer in putting your money where your mouth is. So I would never work with a brand that I haven't spent my own money on beforehand. And so I suppose that's an invitation to whichever company owns Pringles. They're absolutely delicious, as we all know. They are strangely calorie dense. I know that most people know that they're not particularly healthy. But even in terms of the density of calories that we try and get through expedition food, they're not too far off. But most usefully, once they're all gone, that tube, I mean, you don't want too many of them, but that tube is very useful for really forcing down into the bottom wrappers, little bits of rubbish. And so instead of a huge bulging rubbish bin, which you at some point need to get rid of, or maybe incinerate one evening and then sort of compact that down, instead you can force all your little wrappers into this tube, and it makes the inside of your sled a little bit neater. So it's also like a housekeeping tip as well, using Pringles cans.
So Pringles brand, if you're listening, sponsorship opportunity.
I'm not generally expecting an entire wholesale change of the population to start using Pringles cans as rubbish bins, but anyhow, it's a secondary use.
Students do. Toilet breaks, how are they handled? I mean, it's freezing cold. How, as a man in particular, do you?
Yeah, toilet breaks are handled extremely rapidly, and you tend to get a sort of a technique down. Everyone has their own way of doing things, of course. The most obvious technique for the more straightforward toileting requirement, let's say, is just turn your back to the wind and get on with it. Now, when you want to do something a little bit more elaborate, you do need more of a technique, because that is actually a time when you are quite vulnerable. You could get cold fingers because I won't go into too much detail, but of course you need a little bit of dexterity. And you are not at that point going to be fully clothed, so you need to look after yourself. And I mean, if there's an absolute storm raging, then you do need to take your shovel out, build like a little protective wall out in the snow that can protect you from the wind, and then you can do what you need to do. But generally, all you need to do is get yourself into a little bit of shelter and crack on. Actually, one tip that I will share is that we don't tend to take toilet roll from the outside of the roll. We tend to take it from the center, because from the center, as you pull, it comes out obviously in one sort of neat neat progression, and then you can simply rip it off and go, which means you can kind of do it one-handed, and so you can stick that down into the top of your jacket, and so you can have one hand steadying yourself with your shovel and the other hand doing what needs to be done. There are other tips I probably can share, but I think they're probably beyond the scope of
that's enough. That's enough. Thank you. Final thing. What's your final things? I want to talk about your books at the end, but what's your latest expedition? Where are you going, and what are you doing there?
So Alaska. I had this idea about 18 months ago that it would be interesting to do an expedition, particularly in one part of the Arctic that I've not been to yet. I talked earlier before about Greenland being somewhere I spent a lot of my early career, and I don't want to get typecast as just being a Greenland specialist. And of course, Alaska is a very significant part of the Arctic. And because COVID put pay to my last big budget expedition, which was also being filmed for a documentary, that was a very exciting time. But of course, it was completely put pay to by COVID. We actually signed the contracts with the sponsors and everything. I think it was 2 weeks before lockdown began. So that was a pretty heartbreaking moment. But I thought, well, in the time that I need to recover from that, try and build that business back up again, and try and to try and get it refunded, I need to get out onto the ice and do something interesting. And so I found a teammate, James, and we decided that we were going to try and ski the North Slope, which is essentially the huge expanse of open tundra, which covers the top, let's say, the top quarter of Alaska, north of the Brooks Mountain Range. And in a lot of senses, if you look at it, it looks a bit like an ice cap. There's almost no terrain to speak of, apart from just a huge icy landscape covered in actually a relatively thin layer of snow. It's normally only about a foot deep on top of the tundra. And so the plan is to ski all the way from the east to the west. And if that's done, we don't believe anyone has done that in such a sort of a pure form. Of course, there are hundreds and thousands of native Alaskans, and in fact, their ancestors who went across into Canada and Greenland, who will have traveled on that land. But in terms of doing an unsupported crossing from one side to the other without stopping to build camps and villages and to hunt and fish locally, we're simply trying to do an athletic challenge moving from one side to the other. It should be quite unusual and quite novel. And it's a particularly cold part of the Arctic, which is strange because if you look at Alaska on the map, compared to some parts of the Arctic, it's not that far north. In fact, the Arctic Circle is only roughly in across the center of Alaska. But because you do get cold air patterns where it simply sits, not static, but it sort of sits on top of that large expanse of land, you do get cold air just staying put. And so that's why you get temperatures down approaching minus 50. And that's not including wind chill. That's genuine air temperature approaching minus 50. But we're going to be hoping break your record then, to have some temperatures in the minus 20s and 30s too.
Yeah.
That would break my record. I'm not sure how keen I am to keep on breaking this record, because now for successive years, I've now managed to break my coldest temperature record. And although it sounds very impressive, frankly, I'm perfectly happy with minus 47, and I would be deeply, deeply grateful if the Arctic gave me lots of minus 30, minus 35 through this winter coming up.
Your books, you've got 3 narrative books and 1 photo book, and they're available. I'm just going to drop a screen over the top just to show you where the books are available from, but pretty much everywhere. Are they audio books as well, the 3 narrative ones?
They're not. I was with a small publisher, and the resources that go into doing audiobooks are quite significant. And when my first book was published, of course, there were audiobooks, but it wasn't the huge behemoth of an industry that we now see. And so I sort of missed the boat a little bit for those first 3. But I'm absolutely sure that the next one, as and when that happens, will be in audiobook form, because I know that a lot of people like to absorb my offerings when they're walking around or going running or on the train or something like that. And some people simply prefer to listen to, probably not prefer to listen to me, whichever very talented voiceover artist we managed to get. Maybe Stephen Fry, if I think Stephen Fry does almost every voiceover of every book. So yes, that would be nice to do, because it just gives people another way of absorbing what can be obviously quite a long book. And I do tend to get in trouble with editors, because I like to give people value for money, and I give quite substantial manuscripts in and then get told, oh, we need to lose 50,000 words. And of course, that's heartbreaking for an author, because you feel that those 50,000 words are delivering something to the reader.
Also, you can follow Alex's channel, which I mentioned earlier, which is on YouTube, which is at Alex Hibbert Originals. Again, I'll drop the link down in the description for you. Some fantastic, he narrates all of it, amazing adventures. There's some incredible things you do with bits of equipment to fix things when things go wrong, which is just incredible.
Well, that really is the nature of traveling. That really is the nature of traveling unsupported. You've really got to fix everything as you go along, and it's the real difference, I think, between people who have sort of experienced the cold against people who have traveled for multiple days, multiple weeks in the cold, because you can be a little bit more blasé if you live in a cold part of the world and you're simply you're driving to work in a heated truck. You then go into a heated building. if you are a bit careless and you break something, you can just go and replace it. Whereas there's a real impetus that when you're on an expedition or when you're somewhere remote, you've just got to look after absolutely everything. And you've got to be quite inventive sometimes to fix stuff. You're quite right.
Do you want to shout out any of your other social media channels or anything else that you want to talk about?
Yeah, well, I try and do a few different channels for different reasons, and some have worked better for me than others. I've never quite understood, I'll be honest, I've never quite understood Instagram, and so I've slightly dialed down the effort that I've made on it over the last few years. Twitter, I was quite an early adopter, and that's where I talk about a whole range of things, not including the Arctic. Although that again is on a slight hiatus at the moment as I try and work out what direction that platform is going to go in as to whether I want to really invest a great deal more time in it. YouTube, as you say, I've got the Originals channel, which is mostly my expedition videos, but also the development of Alan, the orange lifeboat, that's going to be front and center of my next big Arctic expedition. And then I also have a smaller channel on YouTube, which I'm trying to build at the moment, called Arguably, which is where I have either monologues or discussions about things that I find important and perhaps slightly not controversial for the sake of it, but things I think should be discussed. I've then also, in the last 6 weeks, opened a TikTok account, and yes. I am still yet to be convinced. We will see what happens with that one.
Be convinced. It's a very powerful channel, and the demographic is not where you think it is. Thank you, Alex. That's been absolutely outstanding interview you've given us. Some great insights, a lot of fun, and good luck in your next adventure, my friend.
Thank you very much. It was really, really nice talking to you. And I hope people found what I had to say interesting, or at least gives them some food for thought and maybe some inspiration for some further reading.